Bonita Springs, Florida. Monday, June 29, 2015. Dr. Teresa Sievers did not show up for work. Her assistant, Sandra Hoskins, called and texted her. No response. She called her husband, Mark. He, Teresa, and their 2 daughters had spent the weekend in New York. Teresa had flown back home that Sunday night to be at work Monday morning. When Teresa's assistant, Sandra, called Mark, he said he couldn't get a hold of her either. Then Teresa's friends, Dr. Mark Wright, went to Teresa's house to check on her. He found her dead on the kitchen floor. There was a hammer next to her, and the back of the head was bashed in. A pool of blood around her head. She was cold to the touch. He called 911. The autopsy would show that she suffered 17 impact wounds to her skull. She was 46 years old. The trip to New York was a planned family vacation. Investigators believe that Teresa was attacked from behind as soon as she walked into her kitchen. She was struck repeatedly with a hammer. A break in the case came from the state of Missouri. There were electronic footprints. Mark Sievers' family described his reaction as, he couldn't speak. He's not the kind of guy that's overly emotional on the outside, but he couldn't speak. Mark Sievers said he had no idea what happened to Teresa. Mark met Teresa in 2003 when he was visiting St. Petersburg, Florida. He was working as a nurse. Teresa was recently divorced. They married in 2003. 6 months later, their first daughter was born. They built a large house in Bonita Springs, and in 2007 their second daughter was born. Teresa opened a holistic practice, specializing in blending traditional and alternative medicine. She promoted her business in speeches and videos. She would have patients from all over the world. Teresa was the main breadwinner. Mark was the office manager at her practice, and he helped raise the kids. As you would expect, investigators looked at people close to Teresa, such as her husband, staff at her practice, and if there were any disgruntled patients. According to Teresa's family, Teresa was devoted to Mark. Teresa said she would never leave Mark. Nevertheless, within weeks, Mark Sievers became a person of interest. He cooperated with investigators and spoke to them without a lawyer. He handed over his cell phone and allowed them to download the contents. Mark Sievers had an airtight alibi. At the time of Teresa's murder, he and their 2 daughters were with Teresa's family hundreds of miles away in New York. Mark Sievers reportedly had a gun strapped to his waist at his wife's funeral. He was concerned that the killer or killers would come after the rest of the family. Nobody knew who would want to kill Teresa with such anger and brutality. Some thought maybe it was a burglary. There were signs of forced entry, pry marks on a side door, but Mark Sievers' extensive gun collection and $40,000 in cash discovered inside their home hadn't been taken. The house also had an alarm, but inexplicably, it was not activated that day. While the family was on vacation, Mark had asked his mother, Bonnie Sievers, to feed the family pets. She had trouble setting the alarm that Sunday and told detectives her son Mark said not to worry about it. Around the time of Teresa Sievers' murder, there were suspicious deaths of other alternative medicine doctors in the U.S. But there was no real evidence to make that connection. Investigators turned their attention to the people who might have had an axe to grind with the doctor. Police were also interviewing all of Teresa's friends and family. It was a wide-open field of suspects at that point. Then a surprising name emerged. In her police interview, Dr. Sievers' sister, Annie Lisa, said she heard Sandra Hoskins was a disgruntled employee. That's the same Sandra who seemed so upset by Dr. Sievers' death. Apparently, Sandra did not like Teresa. She would badmouth her to patients, saying Dr. Teresa is a bleep. Sandra, who claims she had been treated harshly by Dr. Sievers in the past, had planned to hand in her resignation that very Monday the doctor was murdered. According to Sandra, Teresa told her she was bringing bad energy to the office. Some people theorized that Sandra had had enough. However, Sandra Hoskins was cleared when 2 months after Dr. Sievers was murdered. There was a break in the case. Police made arrests, and the suspects were not from Florida. In August, the sheriff announced the name of the first suspect, Jimmy Rodgers. He's from Missouri. About an hour later, law enforcement picked up a second suspect, Curtis Wright, also from Missouri. To solve this murder, investigators would travel more than 1,000 miles. No one had ever heard of the suspect Jimmy Ray Rodgers. But Curtis Wayne Wright, he goes by Wayne, was known to Mark Sievers' family. He was Mark's friend. Wayne and Mark had grown up together in Missouri. Wayne was at Teresa's funeral. He was also at Mark and Teresa's wedding. And just 2 months before the murder, Mark Sievers had been Wayne's best man at his wedding. Wayne was also a familiar face around the doctor's office. The staff at Teresa's office knew Wayne as the computer guy. Wayne would travel from Missouri to Florida to work on the computers. They describe him as geeky, but some women found him a bit creepy. Mark and Wayne's appear to be close friends. They met in Hillsborough Elementary School. Wayne was known as a smart guy, fun and dependable. But some people suspected Wayne Wright had a dark side. In 1996, Ronnie Bolin, a preacher, mysteriously disappeared. His body has never been found, and according to police, Ronnie was last seen with Wayne. Ronnie's family believes Wayne Wright was the murderer. The motive was money that Wayne owed Ronnie. Police found Ronnie's car with the car keys still in the ignition in a car wash in St. Louis. Wayne has never been charged in Ronnie's disappearance, but he is listed in a police report as a person of interest, and Wayne's no stranger to the criminal justice system. In 2011, he was serving time for drug possession when he befriended the other suspect in Teresa's murder, a young Jimmy Ray Rodgers, who was doing time on a weapons charge. Jimmy was released from jail and he desperately needed a job. Tyler Juliet and Jeff Conway hired him to work at a contracting company. According to them, Jimmy liked to tell a lot of stories. Nobody really believed him. He liked to brag about the things he had done in the past. A colorful criminal past. Jimmy would brag about con jobs, stolen merchandise, and counterfeit money. But Tyler and Jeff never felt Jimmy was a dangerous guy. They thought he was all talk. Jeff Conway recalls that he had asked Jimmy to work on Monday, June 29th, but Jimmy texted him back and said he wasn't available. After his arrest, Jimmy adopted the nickname Jimmy the Hammer Rodgers. He probably wanted to make himself sound like a tough and dangerous guy. Back in June 2015, almost everyone in Hillsborough, Missouri, knew that Wayne Wright was planning a weekend trip out of town. Lots of people knew that he was going to Florida. He told some people he was going to visit the Sievers. It wasn't long before police got a tip that Wayne had been in Florida at the time of Teresa's murder, and he hadn't gone there alone. He went with Jimmy the Hammer Rodgers. Jimmy told Jeff Conway a story that his brother had graduated from law school, and that he had invited Jimmy to Florida for the weekend, all expenses paid. But he told his pregnant girlfriend, Taylor Showmaker, another story. He was going out of town for a few days to work with Wayne. He had told her that he was going to Florida to make some money. Weeks after Jimmy and Wayne returned, detectives from Florida showed up in Hillsborough, Missouri. They confronted Wayne about that tip placing him in Florida, but he refused to talk. He didn't need to. A rental car GPS gave the cops what they needed to know. On the morning of June 27, 2015, Wayne Wright got into a rental car in Hillsborough, Missouri, and then went to pick up Jimmy Rodgers. At some point, Teresa's address in Bonita Springs, Florida, was put into the GPS. Then the two men took off for the 1,000-plus-mile ride. After driving all day and all night on Sunday, June 28th, Wayne and Jimmy arrived at the Sievers home. When Jimmy and Wayne arrived around 6 a.m., authorities believe they turned off the house alarm. Then, according to the GPS, Jimmy and Wayne left the Sievers home and typed in another address for a Walmart to do some shopping. Security footage from the Walmart confirmed Jimmy the Hammer was with Wayne. They bought trash bags, flushable wet wipes, black towels, black shoes, and a lockpicking kit. They paid cash for their purchase. After shopping at Walmart, Jimmy and Wayne continued using the navigation system to find the beach. After their beach trip, Wayne and Jimmy returned to the Sievers home where they hung out for hours in the garage, waiting for Dr. Sievers to arrive. In the early morning hours of Monday, June 29th, the GPS again shows Jimmy and Wayne on the highway, headed northbound for the 17-hour drive back to Missouri. The electronic trail would eventually lead detectives to Jimmy Ray Rodgers' door. Just like Wayne, he denied he had anything to do with the murder. But Jimmy's girlfriend, Taylor Showmaker, had a story to tell. Jimmy Ray Rodgers took his girlfriend, Taylor, for a ride along Route 47 in rural Missouri. And along that road, he told her to throw out parts of his cell phone, which he had smashed earlier, some gloves and a jumpsuit. Taylor told police that's when she pressured Jimmy to tell her exactly what happened in Florida. He said that he killed Teresa Sievers, Mark's wife. Florida detectives didn't know why Wright would want to kill his best friend's wife. When investigators downloaded Mark Sievers' cell phone, they discovered that the Sievers marriage was in trouble. Despite having $40,000 in cash around the house, they had serious financial problems. And when investigators discovered 5 insurance policies on Teresa totaling more than $4 million, it was a big red flag. Jimmy's girlfriend had told police that Teresa's death was a murder for hire and that Jimmy was supposed to be paid $10,000. Jimmy told his girlfriend Taylor that Mark Sievers hired Wayne for the hit, and Wayne hired Jimmy. Mark Sievers didn't know anything about Jimmy being hired. The money was supposed to come from the insurance payout, but Jimmy never got paid. Then, almost 8 months after Teresa's murder, Wright, Mark's best friend, suddenly turned on Jimmy and took a deal. Wright pled guilty to second-degree murder. He admitted to planning and participating in the murder. He said the murder was Mark Sievers' idea. Mark Sievers was charged with murder. But Mark Sievers' family believes Wright killed Teresa on his own because he was jealous of his best friend's life. Family and friends point to how Wright began to model himself after Mark, even shaving his head when Mark started to go bald. They didn't look alike when they were younger. More than 4 years after Curtis Wright cut a deal to testify against Mark Sievers and ex-con Jimmy Rodgers, the two men go on trial but separately. Jimmy Rodgers' case went first, October 2019. Prosecution said that the case was a classic murder for hire. Mark Sievers was miles away while Curtis Wright and Jimmy Ray Rodgers killed his wife. Jimmy Rodgers' defense was, Teresa Sievers was killed with 2 hammers, but only one was discovered on the kitchen floor. Prosecution had the video evidence of Jimmy Rodgers and Wright near the crime scene. They had the jumpsuit worn by Jimmy Rodgers. A fiber from the jumpsuit was found on Teresa's body. They had testimony from Taylor Showmaker, Jimmy Rodgers' former girlfriend. She identified that jumpsuit as belonging to Jimmy. She told the jury that Jimmy had confessed to killing Teresa. They had Curtis Wright's testimony. In exchange for his testimony at both trials, Wright was allowed to plead guilty to second-degree murder and will spend 25 years in prison. Wright said Jimmy hit Teresa in a frenzy. Jimmy Rodgers did not testify and his attorney called no witnesses. But his attorney told jurors that they should not believe Curtis Wright. Curtis Wright was the only one involved in the murder, and he's lying to save his own skin. His attorney said Jimmy was not involved because there was only one hammer at the crime scene. Jimmy didn't have a hammer. The jury was out for nearly 2 days. Jimmy Rodgers was found guilty of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. In November 2019, Mark Sievers went on trial for the murder of his wife. He spent much of the prior 3 years in jail, still denying he had any involvement. And his family was still behind him. Mark Sievers, charged with first-degree murder of his wife, faced the death penalty. The prosecutors had cell tower information, call records, GPS records, and surveillance video. Mark Sievers' defense was, all evidence only points to Curtis Wright and Jimmy Rodgers as the killers. Testifying again was Jimmy Rodgers' former girlfriend, Taylor Showmaker. She said Jimmy was promised a payday, but she was unable to connect Mark Sievers to the murder. The case again came down to the star witness, Curtis Wright. Wayne said Mark Sievers was involved in the planning. Wayne said he murdered Teresa because Mark had asked him to do it. Wayne told the jury that Mark and Teresa were having marital and money problems. Mark believed Teresa was planning to leave him and take the kids. The only option he had was to kill her. Mark Sievers did not testify. The jury was out just 4 hours. He was found guilty. On January 3, 2020, Mark Sievers returned to court for sentencing. He maintained his innocence and pleaded for his life. But to no avail. He was sentenced to death. The link in this case is that between Mark Sievers and Wright. Remember, if they can link you, they can sink you.